Marco, Arbin, and Drayton seemed like ordinary men walking the streets of Liverpool. By day, they blended in perfectly neighbors, shopkeepers, friends. But behind closed doors, they ran a hidden network of fear and control, leaving a trail of broken lives that the city never saw coming. Liverpool had always carried a reputation of warmth and pride. The river moved steadily past the docks. Football chants echoed through streets, and nights were filled with light, music, and laughter. People believed they understood their city. It felt familiar, predictable, and safe. Most residents trusted that danger came from obvious places, not from quiet corners or friendly faces. That belief created a sense of comfort that few ever questioned. In recent years, the city had grown busier. New workers arrived, students filled shared houses, and nightlife expanded into areas once quiet after sunset. Bars stayed open later, rides were cheaper, and strangers crossed paths every night without a second thought. This constant movement made it easier for people to disappear into crowds. When someone failed to return home, it was often blamed on missed trains, dead phones, or long nights out. Concern rarely lasted long. At first, the warning signs were small and easy to dismiss. A woman stopped answering messages. Another left a job suddenly. A shared house had an empty room with no explanation. Friends assumed personal choices were the reason. Families were told their loved ones wanted space. Nothing looked criminal. Nothing felt urgent. The city kept moving forward, unaware that these moments were connected. Police reports existed, but they were scattered and incomplete. Each case looked different on paper. Different ages, different backgrounds, different streets. There was no single location, no shared suspect, no clear timeline. Without a visible pattern, the disappearances blended into the noise of a large city. The system relied on evidence, and evidence was hard to see when fear kept people silent. Meanwhile, ordinary streets hid something far more organized. Houses that looked normal from the outside were being used for control and abuse. Cars parked legally and moved without attention. People came and went like any other neighborhood. Nothing raised alarms. The operation depended on staying invisible, and invisibility was easy in a city that trusted its routines. What made the situation more dangerous was how normal everything appeared. The gang did not rush. They waited. They watched. They learned how the city worked and used that knowledge carefully. They understood that chaos attracts attention, but calm allows secrets to survive. By the time anyone sensed something was wrong, the damage was already spreading beneath the surface. Liverpool was not under attack in a way people expected. There were no sudden outbreaks of violence, no dramatic scenes in public places. The threat was slow, patient, and calculated. It relied on trust, silence, and delay. As the city slept peacefully, believing itself secure, a hidden system was quietly taking shape, preparing to leave scars that would not be visible until it was too late. The network that had quietly formed in Liverpool was not obvious to outsiders. On the surface, members of the gang appeared like any other residents working ordinary jobs, renting small houses, opening local shops, and walking the streets without attracting suspicion. They did not behave like criminals. They behaved like neighbors, colleagues, and friends. This careful presentation made them nearly invisible. People passed them every day without realizing that behind their ordinary lives was a carefully constructed system of control, planning, and manipulation. The gang operated like a machine, each member assigned a role that contributed to its survival. Some were recruiters, responsible for identifying vulnerable individuals and gaining their trust. Others acted as enforcers, ensuring that rules were followed and that those who resisted could be intimidated. Certain members were watchers, observing routines, tracking movements, and reporting changes back to the group. Even the money was organized, funneled through legitimate-looking businesses to disguise illicit earnings. Every piece of the operation served a purpose, and the precision with which it ran made it extremely difficult for outsiders to detect. Their methods relied on more than intimidation. They relied on subtlety. Offers of help, friendship, or opportunity were never random. Vulnerable individuals were approached with what seemed like kindness, attention, or protection. Small gestures created trust, and trust opened doors that would otherwise remain closed. Once someone was isolated, the control began. The gang's members were patient, knowing that pressure applied too soon could push a victim away or alert authorities. They understood the value of patience better than brute force. Physical presence alone was not enough. Communication was key, and the network used hidden signals, coded messages, and careful timing to maintain coordination. Houses appeared empty to neighbors, but served as meeting points, surveillance posts, or holding spaces. Vehicles moved inconspicuously, yet always followed the schedules of those being monitored. Money exchanges and instructions were often done through legitimate business channels, ensuring the operation remained under the radar. Even police patrols could pass by without noticing anything unusual. This invisibility was intentional. The gang understood that fear alone was insufficient. It needed to operate quietly, under the radar, in a way that allowed the city to continue believing it was safe. The more normal the gang seemed, the harder it was to suspect them. Families welcomed them, landlords trusted them, and shopkeepers saw them as ordinary tenants or customers. Every positive interaction in the community became a shield that concealed their criminal actions. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how easily they adapted. New arrivals were integrated into the system without attracting attention. When an area became too risky, they shifted operations to a nearby street or neighborhood. Strategies evolved based on observation, experience, and careful calculation. The gang treated the city as a living map, marking vulnerabilities, mapping routines, and anticipating obstacles before they appeared. By blending into everyday life, the network created the illusion that Liverpool was untouched by crime. Its presence was felt only by those who had already fallen into its orbit, and even then, the fear was internalized and quiet. While neighbors went about their routines, unaware, a calculated machine of manipulation, control, and secrecy operated in the shadows, expanding its reach patiently and methodically, leaving no traces that would immediately reveal the true scale of its power. The victims were never random. The gang carefully selected those who could be controlled, those whose vulnerabilities could be exploited. They observed their targets for weeks, sometimes months, learning their routines, habits, and weaknesses. Women living alone, new to the city, or struggling financially became the most likely candidates. Single students, young workers, and women isolated from family or friends were quietly watched, their daily lives mapped like lines on a blueprint. The gang treated each target as a problem to be solved, a piece of a larger plan that required patience, precision, and calculated manipulation. The first encounters always appeared harmless. An offer of help with moving, a ride home, a small gift, or casual advice could seem normal, even kind. These gestures were carefully timed to arrive when the target needed support the most, often during moments of loneliness or uncertainty. The attention felt genuine, and the recipients rarely suspected any hidden agenda. What looked like care slowly shifted into control. Trust, once given freely, became a tool used against them. Isolation was the next step. By subtly inserting themselves into the victim's life, the gang created dependence. Small favors built a sense of obligation. Information was gathered slowly. Names of friends, routines, schedules, and personal struggles. Once the victim relied on the gang for support or protection, leaving or resisting became complicated. The gang did not use obvious threats at first. Psychological pressure was more effective. Fear, shame, and confusion replaced the sense of safety. Victims often questioned themselves, wondering if they were imagining danger or if leaving would make things worse. Money and resources were also used to tighten control. Loans, gifts, or temporary jobs created financial dependence. Small debts or promises made the victim feel obligated to comply. The gang understood that people often tolerate abuse when they feel they have no other choice. Every interaction was calculated to increase reliance while reducing the likelihood of seeking help. Even neighbors or acquaintances could not easily intervene, as the victim often appeared to be making voluntary decisions. The network also relied on intimidation through observation. Surveillance was continuous. Someone always knew where the victim was, what they were doing, and who they were talking to. Cars, houses, and friendly faces became tools of monitoring, making escape feel impossible. Even small acts of resistance were detected quickly, and the consequences, subtle warnings, threats, or shaming, were enough to instill fear without drawing outside attention. The psychological manipulation was as deliberate as the physical control. Victims were made to question their judgment, doubt themselves, and feel responsible for the abuse. By the time a clear picture of the gang's operation emerged, many had been silenced by fear and confusion. Some tried to confide in friends or family, but the threat of exposure or retaliation often kept them quiet. Each story was hidden behind layers of shame and secrecy, making detection and intervention extremely difficult. By the time authorities began to see a pattern, the gang had already moved to the next set of victims, using the same methods in a new area. Trust, once broken, left scars that could not be easily healed. The strategy of selecting, isolating, and controlling targets ensured the network remained powerful, efficient, and almost invisible. Every victim was a carefully chosen thread in a web that stretched quietly across the city, leaving fear, silence, and despair behind. The system around the gang was fragile, yet it seemed unbreakable because it exploited the gaps in society, law enforcement, and public awareness. Reports were filed, but they rarely formed a coherent pattern. Each incident appeared isolated, a personal issue or a bad choice, rather than part of a larger operation. Police were overworked, overwhelmed with routine cases, and hesitant to pursue suspicions without concrete evidence. Victims often hesitated to come forward, fearful of judgment, retaliation, or disbelief. By the time authorities began to notice the frequency of complaints, the gang had already adapted, covering their tracks and moving operations to different neighborhoods. Local agencies tried to respond, but the signs were subtle. Missed appointments, unexplained absences, or changes in behavior were easy to dismiss. Friends and family assumed personal struggles or poor decision-making rather than organized abuse. Each overlooked warning allowed the gang to operate with impunity. Even when police investigated, the network's careful planning and ordinary appearances made it difficult to establish connections. The houses looked normal, the vehicles were legally parked, and the members blended seamlessly into community life. There was no evidence that could be easily documented, no dramatic scenes to attract attention. The gang also understood the importance of reputation. Their outward appearances of normalcy, holding jobs, interacting politely with neighbors, paying rent on time created a shield of credibility. Community members trusted them, not realizing that trust itself was a tool of manipulation. People who reported concerns were often met with skepticism. They were told to wait and see, or not jump to conclusions. Each delay worked in favor of the gang, giving them more time to strengthen their network and silence those who could expose them. Inside the operation, members communicated efficiently and discreetly. They coordinated movements, monitored targets, and managed resources without raising suspicion. Evidence that could implicate them was carefully destroyed or hidden. Any hint of exposure triggered immediate adjustments. Properties were abandoned, individuals were replaced, and schedules shifted. Even law enforcement officers who began to see patterns faced frustration, as each lead seemed to evaporate before it could be fully investigated. The psychological toll on victims was immense. Fear, shame, and confusion often prevented them from reporting abuse promptly, if at all. Silence became a weapon in the gang's arsenal, protecting the network while isolating those who had been harmed. The lack of visible violence made the system seem less urgent, less dangerous, until patterns were unmistakable. By the time outside intervention became possible, the network was deeply embedded, difficult to dismantle, and capable of replacing members as quickly as they were removed. The failure of the system was not simply a matter of incompetence. It was a combination of societal blind spots, procedural limitations, and human hesitation. Vulnerability was everywhere among residents who assumed safety, among authorities who lacked evidence, and among individuals afraid to speak. This gap between perception and reality was precisely what the gang exploited. Their success relied not only on secrecy and control, but also on a system that underestimated the quiet, methodical threat developing within its streets. Each delay, each missed warning, each ignored complaint became part of the gang's strategy. The city, trusting in its routines and the ordinary appearances of its residents, unknowingly allowed the network to thrive. By the time investigators began to connect the dots, the gang had already built layers of deception, creating a fortress of manipulation and fear that could only be dismantled through careful, patient, and relentless effort. The system had failed those it was meant to protect, leaving the city vulnerable to an enemy that lived openly among them. The first real breakthrough came slowly, almost imperceptibly. Patterns that had once seemed random began to emerge. Investigators noticed overlapping locations, houses, streets, and businesses that appeared in multiple reports. Vehicles, previously dismissed as unrelated, were now tied to several incidents. Financial transactions once seen as ordinary or coincidental revealed unusual regularities. What had seemed like isolated cases now hinted at something larger, something organized and deliberate. The city that had once assumed these were unrelated events now faced the frightening reality that a network had been operating quietly under its nose for years. Authorities began to piece together the structure of the operation. There were leaders, individuals who orchestrated activity from behind the scenes and ensured obedience. Recruiters were responsible for identifying potential victims, often choosing the most vulnerable. Enforcers maintained discipline within the network, ensuring compliance and instilling fear when necessary. Watchers observed victims' routines and reported any signs of deviation. Money managers handled finances, moving funds through legitimate-looking businesses to mask illicit activity. Each role was carefully defined, creating a hierarchy that was both efficient and difficult to infiltrate. The methods used to control victims were shockingly precise. Trust was weaponized at every stage. Initial kindness and assistance created bonds that victims could not easily break. Surveillance was constant, with seemingly mundane details such as phone calls, social media activity, and travel patterns meticulously monitored. Subtle intimidation reinforced obedience, and the psychological weight of constant observation left many feeling trapped. The gang had studied human behavior and knew exactly how to exploit fear, dependence, and shame to maintain power. Even as investigators started connecting the dots, the gang adapted quickly. Patterns identified in one neighborhood caused them to shift operations to another. Leaders maintained flexibility, constantly reassigning members and rotating locations to avoid detection. Ordinary appearances remained their greatest shield. Shops, homes, and vehicles all seemed normal to casual observers. The public, unaware of the hidden threat, continued to trust and interact with the network without suspicion. This ability to blend in made the investigation a constant race, with law enforcement always one step behind. For the first time, the scale of the operation became clear. The network was not small or disorganized. It had grown methodically, expanding its reach across multiple neighborhoods and maintaining influence over dozens of victims. The meticulous planning, combined with patience and careful execution, explained why earlier warnings had gone unnoticed. What had once been dismissed as coincidence was now revealed as a deliberate, calculated system. The revelation shocked the city. Liverpool, which prided itself on community and familiarity, realized that danger had been hiding in plain sight. People struggled to comprehend how ordinary-looking neighbors could be part of something so sinister. The psychological impact on victims and their families was immense, but the clarity of understanding also fueled determination. Law enforcement now knew what they were facing, and the investigation gained urgency, focus, and strategy. The cracks in the gang's facade were finally visible, but dismantling the network would be neither quick nor easy. Every action had to be calculated to avoid alerting the members. Surveillance, arrests, and evidence collection required coordination and secrecy. The network that had once seemed untouchable was vulnerable, but only if the authorities acted precisely, without mistakes. For the first time, the city had a chance to confront the hidden force that had quietly manipulated, controlled, and terrorized its residents. The pattern was clear, the structure was known, and the battle to take the network down had officially begun. The most disturbing aspect of the network was not its organization, but the way its members lived double lives. By day, many appeared entirely ordinary parents taking their children to school, workers commuting to offices, shopkeepers serving customers, and neighbors attending community events. These public personas were carefully maintained, polished, and reinforced by behavior that seemed harmless, even respectable. To anyone observing casually, they were no different from the rest of Liverpool's residents. They participated in local events, paid bills on time, and held conversations about everyday life, all while concealing a sinister reality that few could imagine. At night, a different world emerged. Members of the same households, workplaces, or neighborhoods were engaged in abuse, exploitation, and intimidation. The contrast between their public and private behavior was striking, and it made detection exceptionally difficult. Victims often struggled to reconcile the seemingly normal appearance of their abusers with the trauma they experienced. The knowledge that someone could appear trustworthy in public while causing unimaginable harm in private created a pervasive sense of confusion and fear among those who survived. The gang's ability to maintain a double life relied heavily on planning, coordination, and strict rules. Activities were compartmentalized. Some members never interacted directly with victims, instead managing finances or logistics. Others were responsible for recruitment or enforcement. Each person understood the importance of secrecy and consistency in their outward behavior. Even within the network, information was shared selectively. By isolating responsibilities, the gang minimized the chances of anyone accidentally revealing the full scope of the operation. This double life also helped the gang manipulate the public perception of danger. Families, friends, and authorities could not reconcile the idea. Someone they saw daily, someone who smiled at neighbors, worked diligently, or volunteered in the community, could be capable of such crimes. The contrast created a psychological blind spot. People did not expect evil to wear an ordinary face. The gang exploited this gap, knowing that their apparent normalcy would shield them from suspicion and provide cover for illegal activities. The impact on the victims was profound. They were often surrounded by individuals who seemed normal, friendly, or even protective. Survivors described confusion and disbelief, struggling to understand how someone who appeared trustworthy could manipulate, intimidate, and harm them. Fear was amplified by the knowledge that others could see the abuser in public without suspecting wrongdoing. The gang's dual identity made escape and reporting even more challenging, as victims feared that outsiders would dismiss their experiences. For law enforcement, the double life presented a significant obstacle. Investigators had to navigate a world where appearances were misleading. The contrast between day and night behavior complicated surveillance and identification of key members. Operations required meticulous planning. Ultimately, the gang's ability to maintain dual identities was both a shield and a weapon. It allowed members to move freely within society. The revelation of this double life shocked the city and underscored the complexity of the investigation. It was a stark reminder. The collapse of the network began quietly, almost imperceptibly, But once it started, the chain reaction was unstoppable. Investigators had spent months gathering evidence, tracing patterns, and connecting incidents that had once seemed unrelated. Small mistakes that had previously gone unnoticed now became cracks in the gang's carefully constructed facade. When the arrests were made, the impact rippled through the organization immediately. Panic spread quietly but rapidly. Properties that had served as hubs for control and surveillance were raided. Items that had seemed ordinary revealed meticulous documentation. The collapse also revealed the internal tensions that had existed for years. Rivalries, jealousy, and mistrust surfaced under pressure. Members who had previously acted in solidarity began to turn on one another, revealing secrets and weaknesses. The network, which had relied on absolute secrecy and discipline, was being dismantled from the inside out. The collapse of the network brought a complex mixture of relief and anxiety to the victims. Relief that their tormentors were caught, but anxiety over retaliation and ongoing trauma. Liverpool, a city that prided itself on safety, struggled to reconcile the reality of a criminal network operating openly for years. By the time key members were apprehended, the infrastructure was destroyed, and survivors' stories ensured accountability. The city was changed. Beneath the surface, a profound shift took place. Trust was fractured, and the scars, though invisible, shaped the city's perception of itself. Recovery for survivors was long, requiring counseling and support to reclaim their lives. The case prompted a reflection on systemic failures and the cost of silence. Ultimately, Liverpool learned that danger often hides behind ordinary faces, and vigilance is a communal responsibility.